Welcome to Follow Your Curiosity. Ordinary people, extraordinary creativity. Here's how to get unstuck. I'm your host, creativity coach Nancy Norbeck. Let's go. My guest this week, Stacey Smith, was one of my first guests in 2019 when we talked about the creative side of mathematics and particularly about mathematical models of disease outbreaks and the occasional zombie apocalypse. We also talked about how Doctor Who influenced her decision to become a mathematician in the first place. I asked Stacey to come back and talk about her own personal gender transition, both in terms of how that's influenced her own work and what it's taught her, and also to give us an update on how her mathematical work came into play when the COVID-19 pandemic hit. I think you'll be surprised by a lot of what she has to say and also find her outlook quite hopeful across the board. And you might just find yourself interested in at least one of her new books. I'd like to dedicate this episode to my friend, writing mentor, and fellow Doctor Who fan, Rachel Pollack, a transgender pioneer whose long battle with cancer just ended on April 7th, but whose influence will be felt for generations to come. Here's my conversation with Stacey Smith. Stacey Smith, welcome back to Follow Your Curiosity.
Thank you very much for having me again.
My pleasure. So there are a ton of things to talk about, but I feel like, I feel like there are two things that we should talk about first, which of course is not possible. So the first thing that we should probably talk about is the fact that the last time you were here, you had a different name.
I did indeed.
Yes. So, and you have a different approach to handling that different name than most people do. And so I wondered if you could kind of go into that a little bit.
Yes, I'm very happy to. So, well, I guess regular listeners will notice I don't have a different voice. I changed my voice, much to my disappointment. So I transitioned in the meantime, and we last talked in 2019. I transitioned in October 2020, and so. Yes, I guess we can get into that as we go. But my approach to this was actually, I got very caught up in it because I was thinking like, how do I kind of change everything? Being someone who has 25 books and 100 academic articles and all these fan publications and everything. And I was like, if I try and change every single publication and interview and everything one by one, it's going to be a nightmare. And I actually thought what's going to do is it's going to make me really depressed. I'm going to be trying to fight this fight all the time. It's going to eat up so much energy and I'm going to win some of the time. And the ones that don't are going to be really upsetting and depressing and things. And I just thought, for my own mental health, I'm just going to not fight it. And I decided that what I would do is just make it historical. So anything that happened before October 2020, that was under my old name, Robert. And anything that happened after 2020 is Stacey. And so that actually worked really well for me. I find like no problems whatsoever with being attached to my old name in a historical sense. I think because I transitioned much later in life than many people, I'm a bit more chill, I think, than some people are about it. Partly because I had it for so long. I was 47 when I transitioned, and so my mother said she had trouble getting my new name because she's like, I knew you for 47 years. I'm like, yeah, that's a decent chunk of time. I understand that it takes time. It's an adjustment for people. I always joke that if people just learned my new name because I told them, my job teaching calculus would be a lot easier. People don't learn like this. They don't learn just because you tell them something. It takes time. It takes effort. It takes making mistakes, getting it wrong, falling backwards, going forward a bit, and kind of slowly piecemeal, kind of getting it all together. And by having that approach, I found actually I was much more chill, and I think people around me are much more chill as well, because a lot of people have said, "Oh, you seem like the one trans person who isn't going to jump on me if I get a pronoun wrong or something." And I'm like, I actually don't think a lot of people are going to jump on you, but I think there's been this kind of like sense that people will leap on you for any tiny mistake. And for me anyway, I think intention really matters. Like, and it's not hard to tell if someone comes with good intentions and they just mix up my pronouns a few times or something, or get my name wrong. Like, it happens. It's a learning process. Sometimes people come in with bad intentions, but it's usually pretty obvious.
That seems sane and reasonable to me. And yeah, I mean, I can't even imagine trying to deal with the headache of going back and retroactively changing that much stuff. I mean,
yeah. Well, actually, I tried to find people to talk to, and there just weren't really any older trans people who transitioned later in life who had this kind of like fame, if you will. And because people have done it, but like they didn't have too much to erase or something, relatively speaking. And like Caitlyn Jenner wasn't really returning my calls. So it's like, who do I talk to? I eventually found an author in the Doctor Who world who'd written some books, and she did the opposite. She actually did change everything, but she'd published through Amazon and stuff like that, where you can change things. But academic publishing is notorious for not changing stuff. I've had enough trouble with the question mark in my name because sometimes they leave that off. And usually, though, I can argue my case based on the fact it was their mistake, not mine. And even then, it takes forever, and it's a huge fight, and like it's a lot of energy eaten up. So yeah, I just having got a bit of advice from somebody, I was like, all right, okay, at least I got something. But yeah, it's very hard to find. I actually found this is a bigger problem that there just aren't really trans mentors around. And at the time I transitioned, I was in a triad with a trans man and a trans woman. And my boyfriend was he was director of Planned Parenthood, so he knew an enormous amount of stuff, and so I had access to a lot of information. My girlfriend had been through very similar things to me. She was also Australian and had a very similar background. But my boyfriend told me, he's like, "You will be mentoring baby trans people in no time at all." And I was kind of like, I don't even know what I'm doing. Like, how can I mentor someone else? And he's like, yeah, but you have mentoring skills. And I was like, oh, that's true. I do that for my day job. And I'm also just naturally inclined, I think, to kind of like, mentoring as a process and kind of reaching a hand down the ladder to help people on their way up. Suddenly I found it immediately true. I was on like, Grinder, and people would be like, oh my God, I think I might be trans, like help. I was like, all right, fine. Let's take off the sexy hat. Let's put on my mentoring hat. Like,
right. Wow. Oof. I hadn't even thought about that piece, but yeah, there's got to be a huge demand for that too.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I found it in my students as well. I remember thinking like, do I want to be really very public about this? And then I sort of thought, you know what, I could really do some good just by existing, and that sure came true. And actually, just the other day, I was checking calculators in my class, making sure everyone had the right one, and somebody, quiet student, the very back row, hands me a calculator, and I slide open the case to check it's the right one, and it is, and there's the trans flag. And they had this moment of like, oh my God, I've been caught. And this person completely passed. Like, I would not have guessed they were trans at all. And I saw the flag, and we had this moment of eye contact. It was kind of like, right, yes, okay, I'm trans, you're trans. We don't need to say anything, but it's all good. And it was right in the middle of an exam, so it was very funny. And I was like, right, this person's been sitting in my class for weeks, like months now, and I had no idea, and they didn't need to approach me or anything. But I was like, I bet I'm doing so much good just by being there.
Right, right. I mean, and I've seen so many posts on social media about David Tennant wearing his trans pin ever
Mhm.
since, I think, is it his son? And, everybody's just like over the moon about it. And I think that is huge too. It's the, different context, but the same
Mhm.
kind of thing. It's like, yes, we see you and it's okay.
Yeah, I actually have to say that the most the easiest bathroom experience I had was at my first US convention since COVID. And I, the bathroom is a scary place to be as a trans woman. And I was sort of thinking like, okay, I'm in the US for the first time since COVID, and like first time since transitioning. And then I gave a panel, and I gave a couple of panels on the weekend, and I went to the bathroom, and suddenly everyone was in the bathroom, and all these women are like, oh, I love your thing. And I'm like, oh, thank you. And I'm like, I normally never say a word in the bathroom because my voice will give me away. And I was just like, oh, this is totally chill. No one is looking at me like you don't belong here. They're just like making conversation, which I have discovered is a thing that happens in the women's bathroom that does not happen in the men's bathroom. And so that's a bit of an adjustment. But I was like, oh, I feel completely comfortable being in this space, and that I was not expecting at all. But I think sort of fan circles tend to be a lot more accepting in a lot of ways, and so gender and sexuality stuff is, I think there's a way in which we're all kind of outcasts already, so we kind of get it. And I think that people who haven't experienced being an outcast in some way, for them it's a much harder thing to grasp. But if you've been bullied for being a nerd, well, you've been bullied for being queer, we're kind of all in the same like bullied gang. So we might as well just get along.
Right, right. And before we get too far into that, I just want to say for people who haven't heard the first conversation that we had, it's up. You have to go back to May 1st, 2019. It's called Modeling Disease Outbreaks, and it is under Robert Smith, and you'll find it there. And that's where you'll hear the whole creative journey that we usually go into in the first episode, which we're not going to today because it's already up there. But yeah, I mean, I have definitely found it fascinating when I go to a con, the amount of cosplay that transcends gender boundaries and all
Mhm.
of that kind of stuff. And I think, by definition, a con is where you can let your freak flag fly no matter
Yeah.
how it comes out anyway. So it seems really kind of a natural thing to me that that would have happened when, you know, that nobody would bat an eye. At least I would
Yeah,
certainly
yeah.
hope not.
That's
I'm
yeah, that's
sure
right.
that it happens
Mhm.
in certain circumstances, but I would hope that it would happen on a less regular basis
Yeah,
in that
it's definitely in
environment.
the minority, which is okay. Like, yeah, yeah. I mean, I remember somebody said once, like, the thing about conventions is like the most embarrassing thing about you is the reason you're there, and so
Right.
you might as well just chill out. And it's like, yeah, right. Oh my, my incredibly embarrassing, fan hobby is actually the reason we're all in the same place. So, nothing really matters in this space. It's a very protected space.
Right. And there's a quote. I was just looking at the trailer from Doctor Who Am I the other day, and there's someone in that trailer who says something like, this thing that you love more than you're supposed to, that other people don't understand because you love it more than you're supposed to.
Yes,
And you
very
walk
much.
into this con and everybody else who's there loves it more than they're supposed to, too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's an amazing experience, even if you only connect with it on that level, and then you can go on so many other levels with it too as soon as you walk into
Yeah,
a con.
yeah. Actually, one of my early transitioning experiences was I was dating someone who had met at a Doctor Who convention, and then we were at a different one, and then we were spending a lot of time in our hotel room, and then she did makeup on me. It was the first time I'd had makeup done, and this was some years before I transitioned. And then we went down to go to the dance, and I went out in makeup, and I was like, oh my God, I'm out here. And I thought, wait a minute, no one's going to care. Like, this is
Yeah,
a convention. People crossplay all the time. Like, it's fine. So it was a really safe place for me to do some exploring in the early days.
I love that. That's just so perfect. It never occurred to me that that would be the environment where someone would get to do that for the first time, but it's absolutely perfect.
Hmm.
Huh. So, I mean, I know that you have, because you have the mentoring and you're in the classroom and everything, and you've taken on the idea that you're basically an open book about all of this, because if people don't take the time to educate, then we're still going to bump up into all of the ugly issues that we've been seeing more and more in the last couple of years. And I'm wondering, like, how has that affected both your transition process and also your teaching process? I mean, has that caused trouble for you while you're teaching, or has it pretty much been accepted in the classroom and in the administration? Or
Yeah, so I would say, generally speaking, I've had a dream run. I've had almost no problems. I've had little tiny things here and there, but really nothing to speak of. And this was quite a shock to me because for some years I'd sort of said, oh, I wouldn't transition unless society made it easier. And I sort of thought, I can live without this. It looks like way too much hassle. Like, oh my God, I'm going to be fighting every battle. Everyone on the street is going to harass me. Everything that can go wrong will go wrong every day. And I thought, I don't know if I have the energy to do that. And effectively, what happened was society did make it easier. And so I talked to some people, and they said about 2018 was about the inflection point. And you sort of had Me Too, and you had like some other things. And when I talk to like people who transitioned before about 2018, their stories are kind of horror stories. And the certainly like in Canada and Australia, say, which are not a bit different from the US, which is undergoing a different kind of thing. But people saying like it was difficult, and after 2018, it wasn't that difficult. And I was definitely post 2018, so for me, it was surprisingly difficult. And I think a lot of that is actually just the sheer amount of privilege that I have as white tenured professor, like very confident. I'd also done all my therapy. I really knew who I was already, and then I transitioned, which I think is pretty rare. I think most people are struggling a lot with their identities when they transition, and so I'd separated those two. So lots of things kind of fell into place for me. And I had some pushback, but it wasn't bad pushback. Like my colleagues, like they're mathematicians, they're sort of like small c conservative, and so they don't really get it. But they don't really oppose it either. Like it was kind of like they were like, oh, you want to do this weird thing? Okay, well, but their major objection, which I knew would happen, was they said, but what about the students? Like, you can't do this in front of the students. And I was like, I'm just going to stop you there because no one under 35 is going to have any problem with this whatsoever. And I kind of threw that as a glib line, but I was like, actually, I think that's true. And that has certainly been my experience. And I've not had any problems at all from students, not even slight things. Very occasionally they'll misgender me and then they fall over themselves to apologize. Even when like I don't even correct it, they'll correct each other and then they're like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. And so like they fully understand stuff. And my colleagues were very surprised by this, I think, because I think they suddenly felt like dinosaurs, which they kind of were. And they were like, wait, what? And I was like, if you have a problem, you have to own it. And I basically just sort of challenged them to look me in the eye and come at me. And they backed down. And I found this a really good strategy. I've had like a lot of people kind of like be like, oh, I wouldn't be into trans people or so on. And then I've put myself in their space and I was like, right, you got to do this in person. And it's not quite so easy when somebody's there. That's especially true, I think, when you've known the person a long time. I live in Canada, but I'm from Australia. So when I went back to Australia, like once things had opened from COVID, having transitioned, and it had been about a year or so, and then my mother had told me like all the different relatives and so forth who would like not be okay with my pronouns and not going to use my new name and all sorts of things. And so I went and put myself in the space of every single one of them, made them look me in the eye, and then it's like kind of like I double dare you to do it, and they all backed down. And it was quite amazing. Like, it was just one by one. I didn't even think they would. I just thought, okay, we're gonna have this out. And I had backup plans in one case. There was an aunt who was like swore blind she would never ever call me Stacey. And then I was like, right, I'm gonna start calling her by her like dead husband's name, which they had a very tempestuous marriage. I thought I'm going in strong. And then I stood there, looked at her, and then she completely went, oh, Stacey, hi. I was like, oh, well, I won't be needing this weapon, will I? It was, I was ready to go, and it didn't happen nearly as much as I thought. I had a high school friend who sort of told me that I wasn't allowed to use the women's bathroom. And so then I went out for a drink with him and I sat deliberately right near the women's bathroom when the men's bathroom was in a totally different part of the bar. And I just ostentatiously went to the bathroom a bunch of times and he just sort of sat there and went, yeah, okay. And what I found was by doing this, because I had the ability to do it, not everyone does. I have, I'm in an unfireable job. I'm quite confident in myself. I have like, well-established connections with a lot of people because I'm really a people connector. It made people sort of, I think, face some things about themselves that in the abstract might be like, oh, I don't really like that idea. But when it's, oh, wait, it's this person I knew who now I just know under a new name and they seem okay. I feel like that does a lot of good in the world because then they can talk to their friends later and say, well, actually, I do have a trans friend and so on. And my mother sort of went from being like, oh gosh, I don't know about this. And, I really liked your old name because I was named after her father. I got her to name my middle name for me, but like she wasn't so into like my new name. She was particularly upset that it was an American name. So I found that quite funny. So it's like, it's not a British kind of name, is it? It's an American name. And I was like, yes, it is actually, you're right. And so she's like, I don't like that. And I was like, okay, well, that's your objection. That's fine. But then the first year that I went, she was kind of like, it was a work in progress to try and get names and pronouns and stuff. But the second year I was back, this past Christmas, she was really on it and she clearly practiced and she was great. And she was doing good ally work of kind of like correcting other people. We ran into someone and the person said, oh, aren't you the one who has a son in Canada? And I was standing right there and I said, oh, actually, kind of that's me. Like, I'm the one that you mean. And my mother just very smoothly went, have you met my daughter, Stacey? I went, oh, that's perfect because I don't have to do that work. And she did it. And she just slid in there. And I think she discovered that she's actually like the cool old lady now who's cool with trans stuff. And all the old lady friends are like, they're weirded out by it. But she's like, oh, no, I'm totally fine with this. And she gets kind of kudos for doing that. So, I'm like, this is really nice. And, it took some time, but she came around. And I feel like I'm very good at kind of like calmly, patiently, kind of like just putting it out there, putting it out there, and not being too much of a scary like person. And people come around, and that's generally been the case for lots of things in my life.
Well, and isn't that interesting too? Like, I think and I think this applies in so many situations, when we are just kind of like, hi, this is me. This is the situation. This is the story. Other people have a hard time, I mean, if I stand here and am holding a banana and I say, hey, here's a banana, most people are not going to say, you idiot, that's an orange when it's obviously a banana, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, when we're confident and it's just like, yep, this is the truth. This is, hi, this is me. This is who I am. It's a lot harder for people to stand there and argue. I mean, and I've seen it on Twitter just in the last week in ways that it's just like, you kind of look at it and you go, what is the point of what you're doing? What exactly do you think you're accomplishing? You're just coming off like an ass.
Yeah, I mean, my theory about a lot of these things is most people's stuff is about them.
Hmm.
So if somebody's upset with me using pronouns that they don't like or a name that they don't like or something, that actually says a lot more about them than it does about me.
Yes.
And it took me a lot of therapy to get to this place because, of course, it's very natural because my stuff is about me too, right? So I think, oh my God, they hate me and I'm gonna like take this very personally. And I've learned not really to do that. And I'm like, okay, let me try and see it from their point of view. And I find it very helpful to kind of put myself in other people's shoes even if that person is what might initially be a repulsive kind of attitude to me, I'm still being like, okay, oh, this person is feeling a lot of insecurity because if they've been living in some very privileged majority for a long time and never known anything else, it's a really scary time, right? It doesn't matter that like that's a lot less scary than other scary things that are happening to other people. It's still scary for them, and I feel like having some sympathy for that allows me to kind of sometimes meet them in a place where I can. It doesn't work for everyone, but it works, I would say, much more than I thought it would initially.
That's so interesting because I would be tempted to just be like, okay, you go on with your life and I'm not even going to engage with you because largely it seems to me like it's probably not worth getting that worked up over and putting that much energy into. So it's interesting to
Yeah,
me that, it seems to be worth it some of the time for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously it's good to pick your battles, and I think generally I try and do this in real life, not on the internet so much, because the internet just exasperates all these things.
Hmm.
But I think it's for me anyway. I have the spoons to do it. Not everyone does for sure, and like actually we were in a bar one night, and it was a polyamory social, so it was mixed. Lots of genders, lots of people, but we're all the poly crowd. So we were kind of the weird crowd, very high trans components, like, and there was some people smoking outside and the window was open and the smoke was blowing in and everyone's like, oh my God, the smoke is terrible. And there were a bunch of really dudeish guys just sitting by the window. And everyone's like, oh, can we go ask them? Like, can someone ask them to shut the window? And they were like, Stacey, can you do it? And I'm like, of all people at this table, why are you asking me? There's like 20 people around this table. Like, Stacey, you're the only one who can go talk to them. And I'm like, a bunch of you are not trans and you're picking me to do it. And I'm like, and I looked around and went, you know what? I actually am the one. And so I was like, I don't really want to talk to them either, but at least I can. And it was so funny because everyone was terrified of these guys. And there was like, five guys just having a drink in a bar, but there were only guys in that group. And so I went up and I was kind of like, hey, do you mind closing the window? And they really did not want to. They were like, no. And I was like, look, sorry, the smoke's coming in or whatever. And they're like, and they were sort of looking at me like, what is happening? What is this freakish thing? And one of them got up and went, okay. And he sort of shut it like about halfway. And I kind of noticed that was the only non-white one in the group. I was like, interesting, very interesting.
Very.
So, and I went back and I went, you know what? I got a partial victory. I'll take it. And so, there was less smoke.
Right. Wow. Oof. But yeah, that is interesting that they picked you.
Yeah, it's yeah, and I think in all movements you need all types of people, and so you know everyone does different things. Like I'm not really someone who's very like going to be confrontational. I'm not going to go up and yell at people in the street or something like that. But I can do my thing, and I very much admire other people who can do their thing. And I feel like we all kind of work, in different ways to kind of achieve the same goals. This is how movements really, really happen. And I feel like one of the ways in which I can do that is to kind of be a bit of a bridge between different worlds, because I think we live in very siloed times. Like, it's if you don't like what people are saying, you just, delete them off your Facebook or whatever, and you don't
Hmm.
have to hear them and they don't have to hear you, but then they don't hear alternate voices and so on. And, I've kept a couple of like, very right-wing people on my Facebook. I don't really love seeing what they post, but I'm like, it's sometimes good to keep an eye on what's happening. And also they get to keep an eye on what I'm doing too. And, like this stuff sort of bleeds across slowly. Um, and yeah, and by no means does everybody need to do this. It's just that I feel like I personally have some spoons to do it, so I'll do it. And if that gets exhausting for me, I'll stop doing it. But I'm finding it's actually pretty easy. And I think when it comes to say students, it's a completely different story because I'm the one in the position of power, and I think understanding where my power is really really useful, because basically nobody misgenders me in class because I'm marking their exams. So I'm sure there's some bigots in my classroom, but that's irrelevant because they're not going to say anything. And so, and I think that
Right.
just sort of normalizes it. And I also think there's probably some students who, I don't know, in 5, 10, 15 years time might think about transitioning and go, you know what, I did have that professor once way back in the day. And
Hmm.
so, there's good that I could be doing that I will never know about. And, I just make a point of connection. And I often think about the very first trans person I knew was a librarian in my university when I was an undergraduate. And I turned up as this, naive 18-year-old. And I was like, oh, there's this, person there with this very deep voice and, looks like a man in a dress and so on. And she would sort of like, she'd wander around and, you know, sort of, you're supposed to keep quiet in the library, and people would just talk a lot. And every so often, she would just put on her man voice, and like this booming voice from nowhere would come out, and no one was expecting it because the sort of library monitor is in a dress and stuff. And I was like, oh, that's really quite amazing, actually. And it really shut people up because they just had no idea how to cope. And I often sort of thought back to her because I was like, she was just around all the time, even though I probably barely spoke a couple of words to her in my life.
That's kind of like a magic power, honestly.
Somebody said actually that trans people have this amazing ability to travel in time because if you transition, well, all the people you used to date now have a same-sex partner or something, and you can really mess with their history.
Yeah, that is kind of true. Yeah. So, I mean, what do you think are like the biggest misunderstandings that people have about transitioning or trans people? Like if you could, address the one or two biggest things.
Yeah, I think for me anyway, like I remember really facing down like my family who were really shocked and in tears, and my mother said like, "I thought I knew you," and I was in this mode of being like, "I'm still me." Like I had this just like I'm still me. I might have different hair and different clothes and so on, but I'm still fundamentally myself. And I think that is in some ways the key to it. It's like I watched I was watching Quantum Leap recently. And there was a trans episode on that one, and they have a trans character as a main character, and so that's really cool and stuff. And then that character was saying something like they were talking about these trans kids who were being oppressed in the different like past or whatever. And the character said like, "Oh, trans kids are magic." And then both my partner and I, who was also trans, like we both went, "That's actually not right. It's not that trans kids are magic. It's that trans kids have the right to just be kids." Like they're kids like any other kids. Like they have their own like foibles and quirks and stresses and all sorts of things, and they should be allowed to have a childhood. And it's like that's where things are really kind of getting messed up, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think there's this push in both sides to be like, oh, we've got to protect the children from this thing, or we've got to like oh no, but like trans people can do no wrong, and like if they do anything, like it must be okay. And it's like, no, we're just people, we just exist. And I sometimes think like I think that the gender stuff is the most obvious thing about me when people meet me, and yet in some ways it's one of the least important things about me, now that things have settled down in terms of my gender identity. And so it's obviously there, but like of the big things around me, it's much smaller. They asked me to be on a diversity panel at a math conference, which I do a lot of. And they said like, oh yeah, we really want you to talk about like the trans experience and how it held you back from like your career goals. I was like, it didn't hold me back at all. I was a full professor by the time I transitioned. This was not a barrier. Like yes, I had some things in the back of my head, but they didn't interact with my career at all. And I said to them like, look, I can talk about queerness and I can talk about transness, but like actually the thing I'd really like to talk about is class, because class, that was the big one. Like I came from a working class background. I didn't know what university even was. Like that was a really hard challenge to overcome. They said, oh, we don't want to hear about that at all. Like, don't talk about that. Just talk about this hot button issue that you have. And I was like, yeah, the class one is way bigger, like, to be honest. So I think really my answer is, yeah, we just exist. Like we're just people.
And we're not just a hot button issue.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, ugh. I find that so frustrating because, like you say, we're all just people. We're not just one part of who we are. We are all
Yeah.
so many things. And
hmm
yet it's so easy to define people by the thing that's most visible or most odd, or that stands out in whatever way to you
hmm
about that person, when none of us are just that one thing. We're all
Exactly.
so
Yeah.
many things that inform
hmm
who we are and our experience. And I feel like we all shortchange each other all the time because
hmm
I think we all do it, because it's so easy and
Yeah.
it's kind of ingrained in us,
hmm
for a long time. So it takes effort to overcome and to remember that, oh, right, I'm a complex person with all of these different facets. And so is this person out on the street that I'm
Yes.
looking at. And all I see is that they look scruffy or that they look like
Yeah.
they're filthy rich or,
hmm
whatever. And I really wish we were better at remembering that.
Yeah, it's very ingrained in us. I think we as a species are used to sifting a lot, right? We're like, okay, I'm making very snap judgments because I, for whatever reason, needed to do that back in the day, and my my genetic coding is telling me make quick judgments because like if this animal thing has stripes versus has spots, I need to make quick decisions about it, and that's a really useful skill when you're living in the the tundra, but it's not quite
Right.
so useful anymore. Actually, one of the things my brother said when I transitioned, like my father had died not just before COVID, so before I transitioned, and so my brother, who's like a manly plumber and everything, and he said, "Look, I don't really get it, but like of all the weird things you've done, this is not the weirdest." And he's like, "The vegan thing, what was that? Polyamory? I don't understand that in the slightest." Like he starts listing like things that I was like, "You know what? You're not wrong." And he said, "At least I've heard of this one." He's like, I sort of know what this is." That's like, wow, this is maybe my most mainstream change. Like, there we go.
That's such an interesting way to kind of be accepted in a backwards sort of way.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, it
Yeah.
actually weirdly it drew my brother and I together much closer than we had been as adults. We'd been quite close as kids, but we drifted apart a lot as adults. And I have two sisters, and so I think suddenly my brother was like the only man in the family left because my dad is gone, and now I've switched over. And so my brother, I think, suddenly went. I think he'd kind of all like he was younger than me, so he'd always wanted to be the older brother. I think, and I was like,
Now
"Here, you can
he
have it.
is.
Like, you can have the patriarchy. It's all yours." And he's like, "Thanks, I've always wanted it."
Oh, that's
Yeah.
funny. Oh my. That's kind of a transition for him too, in a way.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
was. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
and I remember he said he told his kids who were sort of 12 and 14 or something, and he's sort of very carefully trying to explain to them, and they were like, yeah, and he's like, no, but do you understand? And they're like, of course we understand, and he's like, oh, geez, I guess it's me that's not getting it really, and the kids are fine. Yeah.
Yeah, and it is interesting. A friend of mine transitioned starting during the pandemic, and it is really interesting, because I am about the same age as you, and I've found
Mhm.
myself going, this is a very different experience in practice than it is in theory, just watching this, because
Yeah.
I don't have any problem with it in theory, but it is really strange when it's somebody that you've known one way and now you kind of have
Mhm.
to get used to, right, different pronouns, different name, different clothes,
Yeah.
different look, different everything, and it's not actually a problem except in adjusting what's in my head. And that is the
Yeah.
part where
Mhm.
I sometimes go, I'm definitely older than I realized I am, because this is harder than I thought it was going to be. And I wish it weren't. But, and it's that point where you kind of have to say to yourself, well, I wish it weren't, but apparently it is. And
Mhm.
I have to kind of just be patient with myself, because it's a learning process and that's all that it is. And in that particular case, the name didn't change, which I think
Right.
makes adjusting the pronouns a little bit trickier, because
Yeah.
they kind of go
Yeah. Right.
together in your head. And so
Mhm.
it's like, yeah, I'm going to mess this up.
Yeah, and I think the challenge sometimes is like it's hard for everyone. I will say it's hard for me too. I've had like long before I transitioned, I knew people who were post transition, no problem at all. But the people I already knew who then transitioned, I was like, man, it's hard to get the name
Hmm.
straight. It's hard to get the pronouns because it's just you just file someone away in your head as a certain thing, and then you've got to
Right.
now very manually remember it's a different one. And I think that this is not really acknowledged that much as being a challenge. And I think we all have this challenge. I had a non-binary roommate and and they use they them pronouns and they were quite femme presenting and had a feminine name, but they used they them pronouns and they didn't go out much. So I was the major person kind of policing their pronouns, and I was like, geez, it's hard for me, but like I've got to do all the work because it shouldn't be up to them.
Right.
And also mostly I don't talk to people in the third person. I talk to you and I'm using second person. I talk about me
Hmm.
and I'm only talking about third person when mostly the person is not there. So
Right.
it's like, right, I'm kind of, you're outsourcing your pronouns to your friends, which is, a complicated one because then the friends have to step up. And I think like, there needs to be a bit more kind of like understanding. I think that this is a learning process and that's not bad. It's we all go through learning processes, but I think that on the flip side, like generally they say like if you're struggling with something, you should reach outside the circle, not inside. So the person who's transitioned is on the inside. Well, the next layer around, like their family or whatever, they may well have some issues, but then they don't workshop that with the person who's done it. They go to their friends and then they
Hmm.
reach out to their friends and you go outside that way. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to say to like, other cis friends, like, oh geez, I'm really struggling with this person's pronouns, and kind of like workshop that and come up with strategies. And that's actually a really good way to learn is to talk it through. when it goes back into the center and it's the person who's actually dealing with their own stuff anyway, and now also has to support someone doing it, that becomes quite the burden.
Yeah, that's not
I
fair.
think there's a narrative that's sort of formed that says like, oh, you must instantly just take my new pronouns and take my new name and never get it wrong, or else you're a bad person. And I think this is counterproductive. I think this doesn't make a better world. It just makes us kind of like jump on each other when, for the most part, it's people trying to do the right thing. And what I've certainly found is people get scared of getting it wrong, and therefore they stop interacting. And I had people like didn't want to invite me to things anymore because they were just scared of getting my pronouns wrong. And I'm like, I'd rather be invited and have the wrong pronouns than be stuck at home with no friends. Like, I mean, this is,
Right.
really tough one. And also it comes with time. Like I think like I remember sort of mentally thinking, um, like I'll give my family a year. You got a year to get it wrong. After a year, you get it right. So, but that's a long time to get it wrong. You can,
Hmm.
say my old name, you can use my pronouns or whatever, but eventually you can't just stay there. You've got to eventually work towards getting it
Right.
right. But there's a period of grace. And I think that like, I think we could all use a bit more grace in our lives. Mm.
Yeah, and I think there's a difference between I'm deliberately refusing to use your new name
Absolutely. Hmm.
and I keep forgetting, but I really do mean well and I'm going to get there eventually. There's a huge
Yes,
difference.
yeah, that's right. There's massive difference, and I would say my experience certainly is I can always tell that difference. I have never had any trouble knowing who's just slipped up and forgotten, even if they haven't even noticed they've done it, versus who is deliberately doing it. It's not hard to tell in the slightest.
Is there something that you wish you had known before you transitioned that, you would want someone else who was thinking about it to know ahead of time?
Yeah, I wish I'd known how much fun it was going to be. No one told me that part. Like, I thought it was going to be all doom and gloom and dreariness and people harassing me and so on. And I was like, I'm having the best time. Like, this has been amazing. What I didn't realize too was just how much my stock went up. I was on dating apps before, and I would get like, a hit or two a week maybe, and suddenly I was belle of the ball. Everyone was into me. And I was like, well, this is
Wow.
lovely. This is awesome. This is great. I was like, oh my God, this is too much. And I was like, now I am swamped by people. I go on, like, I mean, I was going on Grinder and I'd been on Grinder before. And I was like, oh wow, I'm getting a lot of people on Grinder. Okay, I understand that one. But then I would go on, more kind of like I guess more heterosexually oriented dating apps and stuff, and still I was getting a lot of people, and I was like, I'm still the same person. I've got slightly different looking photos, but as you can hear from my voice, I've not done any like voice training. I'm not on HRT. I'm not. I haven't done any surgeries. I look fairly femme to begin with. Pre-transition, people often would like mistake me for a woman, and then I just decided to lean into that, and I was like, you know what, I think I can get away with it, so I'm just going to do that. And I found for me, a lot of the external accoutrements, sort of having like the hair and the makeup and the clothes and so on, they worked for me. Especially like shaving my body and stuff like that. I was like, oh yeah, I feel very femme when I do these things, and that for me is good enough. And other people make different decisions, and that's great for me. Like I think actually, yeah, the other thing that I wish I'd known was like I had some sense of like you have to be very very far in some level of transition like in order to do it. And so particularly for me, I was kind of like, I don't really want to get any surgeries, and that just wasn't the thing I was into. And I was like, okay, well then I guess I can't transition. And it wasn't until my boyfriend, who was the Planned Parenthood guy, he was like, oh no, you can totally do that. And I was like, you can? I was like, oh, then I'm doing it. Like I would have done this years ago if I'd known. And so I was like, I like a lot of things that I was born with, and I don't want to do anything about them particularly. And I say I might change my mind later. Like I didn't really see the transition coming in some ways, so I don't know what's around the corner, which I find exciting. But for now, I'm quite happy with the bits that I have, and other people make different decisions. But not everyone. I remember the first trans woman that I dated. Like I asked her if she was going to get surgery, and she's like, "No, no, I don't really want to do that." And I'm like, "Really? You don't have to do that?" Like, oh, okay, that changes a lot of things. Um, and so yeah, I think like just knowing that it's a big tent actually. Like like in a way, you're trans if you are kind of like at this disjunct between the gender you were born with and kind of anything else, right? And I talked to my ex-girlfriend, and she said, "Yeah, I'm having some feelings," and I was like, "Okay, what are you having?" And she's like, I don't know if I'm trans or not." And I'm like, "Okay, let me give you a simple test." And so her name was Lillian, and I said, "If I say Lillian, he's a great guy, how does that sit for you?" And she's like, "That feels totally fine." I'm like, "Okay, then you're trans. You don't have to do anything about it, but you're trans." And she's married with kids and quite happy doing that. Not, I think, not particularly interested in changing any of this, but she's trans. And so, that's just, where she's at. There's people then who want to take steps or whatever, but you can exist in this way if you like.
That's so incredibly clarifying in a way that I wouldn't have thought that you could do that. That's so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, we get to choose our own destinies in a lot of ways, right? And I think a
Yeah.
lot of people grew up with the fact that, they were told a lot that you can't, right? And actually you can. And it's very freeing and it's also very scary. And I think people who are more mired in the old ways of thinking are like, no, you just have to accept your lot in life. And I think what I'm seeing, particularly with sort of younger people coming through, who I see both in my students and then also like, in the trans community, which, tends to be a bit younger and stuff, I'm like, wow, here are people who are saying like, no, we don't have to play it your way. Like just because you've done it for forever doesn't mean we have to. And they're really changing it. And I'm like, this is very inspiring. Like this is unbelievable because I was like, wow, if I'd known that we could have said no, I don't want to do the way my parents did. I want to do something else. I was like, I would have done that too. Like we just didn't have
Right.
the power to do that. We just sort of okay, I better suck it up and live whatever life is kind of handed down to me. And so I'm very much loving being able to kind of like live my life as mine. I'm like, I only have one life and I get to do it the way I want to do it.
Yeah, I think that applies in so many ways, in so many areas. And I've
Mhm.
seen a lot in the last couple months that leads me to conclude that, especially for Generation X, there's like the I'm guessing maybe half of us that are much more like the
Mhm.
boomer generation that want all of this traditional everything has to be that way. And then there's the other half of us that are like, boy, look at these millennials and Gen
Yeah.
Zs and y'all go. We didn't know we could do this. Y'all go for it, change everything. Just upend all of it. And we may be too old to come with you, but we're going to sit here and applaud you from the sidelines because this is awesome. you
Yeah,
know?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the funny thing I've noticed about kind of like the younger crowd is like when confronted with new concepts, they're very adept at it. And so, for
Hmm.
example, polyamory, right? I started dating this guy. It was a trans guy, and he'd never heard of polyamory, and he was quite a bit younger, and he was like, "Oh, okay, so how does that work?" And I was like, "Oh, well, date multiple people, and everybody knows, and it's all ethical and so on." He went, "Oh, yeah, okay, that seems quite reasonable." Whereas I feel like I talk to people my age, and I try to explain polyamory for 20 plus years that I've been doing it. They're like, but how could you love more than one person? I'm like, do you love more than one parent? Do you love more than one child? You can do it all the time. They're like, oh, but. Whereas the younger crowd are just like, yeah, okay, let's try that. And so it's quite amazing to me actually how much they don't have to unlearn, and
Hmm.
that's really I think like it shows us how much we are mired in our old ways.
Right. Right.
Yeah, I feel like I've been unlearning a lot, and I feel like I have some commitment to unlearning stuff, and I think that's because I'm an academic. I'm interested in all these things. A lot of people are not interested in unlearning their things, and that's a steep hill to climb for a lot of people. I understand why, but I think it's also a bit invisible that it's like, oh yeah, a lot of the stuff is just my own baggage actually, and I've got to, I probably should deal with that, and it's sometimes easier not to deal with that. Instead, I'll just go and try and harass other people, and so that I don't have to face my own stuff.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of that these days.
Yeah, I think there's a real pushback, and I think like it's it generally happens in these times of like burgeoning acceptance. It's kind of like two steps forward, three steps back. I think we're in the three steps back at the moment. But what happens is it's like there's reactionary forces who are kind of like they can see much better than we can. Right? I'm always amazed at just how well the right wing has their eye on the prize. Like they're kind of like they know the threats that are coming to them, probably because they're terrified of them, and it's like they're generally right. And they were absolutely terrified of gay marriage because they knew
Hmm.
once it got in, it's not getting out again. And they did everything they could to stop it, and they couldn't. And in the short term, of course, they did a lot of damage. And there was, the early 2000s was a really tough time. And then eventually the arc of history bends, and then that one's fine. Okay, well, we'll move on to the next boogeyman. And I remember Trump came in, and Trump was kind of like he started picking on trans people in the military. And I was kind of like, oh, it's trans people next, is it? And it just seems
Yeah.
so odd. I was like, really? Who cares about trans people? Like, in that way, like, why? Like, there seems like so few of us. Like, I wasn't even identifying as trans. I was like, this, is it really anyone worth even going after here? Like, the gays have won, so like, we'll go to the next one. And I think this is what happens. But actually, I think also at the same time, it raises awareness. And so a lot of people go like, actually, people talking about trans, let me look that up and oh, wait, maybe that's me. And that's only happened for me as well. And
Mm.
there's a way in which Trump going after the trans people, like, got me thinking more about it. And I would say like it wasn't completely because of that, but it was like a factor for sure. Um, and so like I actually remember when Trump got elected, the night he got elected, I was in Canada, but I was with like two trans people, one of whom had like a partner in the US and a partner in Canada, and they were both much younger. And I was kind of like, okay, this is depressing for me, but it doesn't really affect me, but it is going to affect them. And I was like, geez, this, imagine being a trans person in Trump's world and so on. And then of course I was later on. And so it's, it's a funny thing, I guess. But I think in the long run, this is one of the sadly necessary steps towards acceptance. I think if you fast forward like a couple of generations, it's going to be just a no-brainer. But of course, in the meantime, a lot of people are going to suffer, and that's the real tragedy.
Well, I hope you're right that in a couple generations, this will no longer even be a subject that anyone thinks is worth debating,
Mhm.
because I would like to think that we're better than this.
I think we are in the long run. I think in the short term, it's very easy to lose sight of that. But I think we are in the long run.
I hope so. So I want to get to the other first question that I had, which is that, the last time we talked, we spent a lot of time talking about the disease modeling that you do and how you modeled the zombie outbreak, which I've finally, late to the party, just started watching The Last of Us. So I've been thinking of you as I've been watching that too. But, I re-released that episode, a year later. I wonder why. And I've been wondering, how your life changed when COVID hit. What happened? Did your zombie research end up influencing what you were doing with COVID? Tell us about all of that.
Yes, yes. So I have been researching pandemics and vaccines and diseases and so forth for more than 20 years now. And along the way, I've been teaching and researching and stuff in various different countries. I've lived through a number of pandemics. I was in the Ebola outbreak in 2015 when I was living in Senegal. I've been caught in malaria outbreaks and all sorts of things. And it was painfully obvious to me when it's somebody's first pandemic, right? COVID, everybody went around like chickens with their heads cut off. I'm like, oh, you poor darlings. First pandemic is it? It's very obvious. You can always spot the newbies. And I think having lived in Africa, I was like watching people who just get very used to this. Like when Ebola hit, I remember that somebody came up to us. We are all standing around a group. They said, there's Ebola here. And we all just instantly, without thinking, we all just took 5 steps back from each other. Nobody is touching anyone. Nobody's close to each other. And it was just, oh, right. Yes, we are social distancing. Nobody said the word social distancing. We knew what to do. It's Ebola. Get the hell away from me. And so suddenly we were trying to buy things from a store and we were like, all right, I'm going to put my money on the doorstep. I'm going to step back. You take the money, like you leave the goods at the store. It was just like we instantly knew how to deal with this. And people took it very seriously. And, that helps a lot. And I think with COVID, what I found was like, the thing I was just not expecting was for a pandemic to happen in my own backyard. I'd been used to going to places where there were pandemics, or at least potentials and so forth. And I was like, oh right, now this is happening where everyone is. On the other hand, I talked to a colleague of mine when it was first starting to spread, and she's like, "Do you think we should get into this new disease and this new COVID thing?" And I was like, I don't know. It's kind of boring, right? And she's like, "Yeah, it is. It's really boring." And I stand by that. It's a really boring disease. Now, good news for us, because you do not want to get caught in an interesting pandemic. That is not a thing you want to be in, right? HIV was a very interesting one. That is a really tough cookie. HIV, we're still searching for a vaccine. Like it's a very, very hard one to deal with. COVID was very, very textbook, right? And what that means is that all the traditional things work. Like techniques that we use for COVID were like masking, distancing, quarantine, and so on. These are not new. These are things we did exactly in Spanish influenza 100 years ago. These things we've been doing since the 14th century, because they're the basic things you would do with this kind of disease. And luckily, we didn't have to really invent new ways of avoiding the disease. So we had to invent other things, but most of it is like stay away from people, right? Don't breathe in the same air, and that will stop us getting infected. And then when vaccines come along, well, we've had vaccines for more than 200 years. It's like, what happens when there's vaccines? There's anti-vaxxers right there. They've been there for the entirety of history of vaccines. There were anti-vaxxers as soon as there were vaccines. And so for me, I think having a much more global point of view, I was like, nothing is surprising here. Nothing at all. Like this went exactly as you would expect. And I remember looking at COVID and discovering it was an RNA virus, but it had an error checking capability. So So HIV is an RNA virus that has no error checking. So what happens is when the virus invades a cell, it makes copies of itself, and then some viruses like measles, they have a way to check the offspring to make sure the offspring virus looks the same as the original virus, and they will correct errors in the DNA if this happens. And so basically, measles is a very powerful virus because the offspring all look like the original. So every single virus particle that comes out of a cell is now a perfectly honed killing machine, can go to the next cell and infect. And HIV doesn't do this at all. HIV makes just random copies of itself, and there's all mistakes all the time. But what happens is that means most of those viruses are not viable. The HIV just has so many virus particles that it just hopes some of them are good enough, and that's basically how it goes about. But it means that if you have any pressure from outside, any evolutionary pressure, the chances that a mutation might exist is very high because HIV has got all these errors all over the place. So it might well have something that actually just happens to work around a vaccine or around a drug or so on. So HIV is very mutable. But COVID, although it was RNA like HIV, it had the error checking like measles. And I was like, that's its Achilles heel. We will get a vaccine, no problem. And we had a vaccine within months. Like, this is astonishing. It's been 25 years for HIV, no vaccine. We have vaccines for, I think, about 12% of all viruses and none for any parasitic diseases. Like, we're not really good at vaccines. And yet COVID-1 comes along and we get 4 of them at once. It was in some ways, this biomedical triumph. Science is really good at coming up with some things, and it's really, really bad at other things. I think we were not good at kind of messaging. I think we could have stopped this pandemic in its tracks. Most pandemics, there's a window of opportunity where if you act quickly enough, you can stop it. We stopped the original SARS. We've stopped some other things, but we did not stop this one. And we basically dropped the ball in like January and February 2020. We could have stopped this, and we just basically chose not to. And I think we chose not to for all kinds of cultural reasons. We kind of went, oh, it's a problem for over there. Won't come here, will it? And of course, we didn't listen to the lessons of history. So we essentially chose not to deal with it. And then we had to pay the price for that.
Yeah. And still are.
And still are. Yes. Yes, very much so.
So when you do your models, what do you think the future is with COVID? Like, how long does it take for something like this to truly, everybody talks about how the Spanish flu was around for a couple of years and now it's just like the regular flu and it's not really a huge deal anymore, or that, different coronaviruses or, and I don't know, I may be mixing up my stories from the last couple of years, but I know I've heard that like one of them, and maybe it was the Spanish flu, is essentially like a cold now. You can correct whatever I'm getting wrong here, but, until it's essentially no big deal and we don't have to be as worried about it anymore. Do you have any sense from the modeling that you've done what it might look like, how long that might be before it's really just kind of out there and not something to get super worried about? I know a lot of people think that we're there now, and I don't think we really are.
No. So I think that the problem with COVID is it's kind of in this sweet spot of like it's quite spreadable. So the R naught, like the reproduction number for sort of original strain COVID was about 2.5, and then for Omicron it's about 8, I think. So this is quite high. Omicron particularly is very high. Measles is like 17, so it's not nearly as bad as it could be, but it's still quite high. So it's quite spreadable, as we saw, because it spread very fast around the world. And yet it's not deadly enough. Like, the thing about Ebola is if it gets into your village is basically toast, right? Ebola is here, it's going to kill a lot of people. And what that means is it can't pass itself on very easily. So Ebola is actually not a very successful disease, right? If you were a virus, you don't want to be Ebola. You want to be HIV that just goes in silently and, lives quietly for 10 years with no symptoms and nobody really worries about it for a long time. That's a very successful strategy. And COVID is kind of in this little midpoint here where it's very good at spreading and actually relatively very bad at killing its host. The reason we die from diseases is not because the disease wants to kill us. The reason we die from diseases is because that's an evolutionary trait on our part. It is to our evolutionary advantage for the weak to die of diseases. That's why this happens at all. And so, COVID is this new thing. Like, it kills us sort of basically by chance because other things like it also will kill us. But it's not deadly enough to kind of burn itself out, and yet it's too spreadable to kind of stop on its own. So that's why we're kind of stuck with it. And I think we are going to be stuck with it for a long time. I think the way that you eventually get rid of a disease that's now endemic like this is you have to wait some generations. You basically have to wait until essentially evolution takes over, and that people who are susceptible to COVID basically, age out or die out. Either the disease kills them or they just die out for other reasons. And then the children of the people who are less susceptible start to take over. And this is exactly what happened in like the Black Death, right? So the Black Death, there were people who were missing an immune receptor of some of their cells, and it was a very tiny chance mutation. It didn't really give you any advantage, except when the pandemic hit, because that made them immune to the Black Death. And then those very tiny numbers of people completely survived. That wasn't that many people, but their children also were often missing the receptor. And then those children, and now there's about 10% of Europeans are missing that receptor, and it makes them also immune to HIV. So this is, evolution in action over the last several hundred years. Is quite incredible to see because of this sort of chance mutation and so on. And so that may well happen. It may be that, some people are, less susceptible to COVID than others. Those people will have more chance of reproducing, and just basically, simple evolution takes over. And fast forward 5, 10 generations, like most people might be immune to COVID for that. On the other hand, it's an arms race, so the disease also can mutate. And if the disease, finds some people who are not susceptible to one strain but are to another, a chance mutation sends that in, and so suddenly now people are more susceptible. And often what happens is diseases go through a lot of mutations, as we saw with COVID, and it's probably not done yet. We'll probably see more mutations coming. And it might well be that it mutates into a much more benign strain. And so essentially what happens is not the disease itself mutates, it's a replacement strain comes along and then it outcompetes the existing one. So essentially Omicron outcompeted the original one. So Omicron was just a much better, more spreadable one. So that's the one that's mostly dominant now. But a future one could come along and it might be worse or it might be better. And we don't really know. There was some thinking that diseases evolve in one direction, and that's been completely overturned. Smallpox went in completely different ways in different parts of history. So it's very difficult to say. We could get lucky and maybe some mild form takes over and we don't even notice that we get it. We could get very unlucky, and it's actually probably the most unlucky situation is what we're in, which is it's kind of in the sweet spot. If we get a really deadly one, that'll kill off anyone who's even vaguely susceptible, and then the survivors will be immune and their children will, and that will actually get rid of COVID too. It's just the middle bit, which is where we'd like to be, which is not having people die. That's probably the one that keeps it around as well.
See, you were supposed to say that like in a year or two, it'll have done its thing.
Unless you buy my product.
Oh, I mean, because we're all so ready to be done. And yet, I don't know. I have trouble with the people who are just convinced that it's all over. Because there are so many of them.
I think the problem is that like we as humans have one really amazing superpower, and that's the ability to tell stories. And so that has got us through so much. I mean, you look at our entertainment, like we're really good at it, sitting around campfires for, millennia. We're really good at this, but it also is used sometimes when it shouldn't be. For example, to just wish stuff away. We're like, oh yeah, I'm just going to tell a story that there is no disease anymore. And oh, it's gone, right? And we have the ability to really believe those stories if we want to. And collectively, we just sort of decided to do that. And I don't know, there is an argument to say like, well, what else are we going to do? We're going to stay in our houses for the rest of our lives, or are we going to do this? And the sad part is a lot of people are going to die. And we've sort of decided as a society that we're willing to do that. And it's really sad. And I don't think you can turn that juggernaut around.
Yeah, I definitely don't think you can. I think it's taken on a life of its own, and there's no change in its course at this point. But yeah.
Now, I'll give you some more optimistic news, though.
Good,
I think
please.
This will help us for the next pandemic, right? The next time there is something like COVID, we will be on it much faster because we don't want this again, right? I mean, we moved on monkeypox really quickly. Like we got people vaccinated, people changed behavior. People took monkeypox very seriously, far more than it probably warranted, given the very small number of deaths that were happening. And people were really, oh my God, it's the next one, right? And I think this will happen for some time. Right. I think that where we saw successful people dealing with COVID was people who'd really suffered under SARS. And so a lot of Asian countries, right, mask wearing wasn't a thing until SARS. And then suddenly it is. If you feel sick, you put a mask on, and it's quite normal. It was quite normal in the mid early 2000s to be on a bus or something wearing a mask if you're in an Asian country. And that just wasn't true here. That will totally have changed now, right? And I was actually, flying home from the US like last week, and I had a small cold. It wasn't COVID, but I was like, well, I have a bit of a sniffle. I'm putting a mask on just because I don't even want to infect anyone with a cold. And I was like, cool, right? I can just do that, and no one's going to look at me funny for doing this. And so I think we've got some cultural changes. I think because of that, we will probably move faster. and more collectively when the next one comes. And if the next one's like not so bad as COVID, then we probably have a good chance of dealing with it where we might not have otherwise. So I think there's hope, and this hope may last for a generation or two. I think that we probably won't see another pandemic for a while because we'll be kind of really, really careful about it. And then, of course, people get complacent and they'll say, "Oh, yeah, COVID, that's just something my grandparents had, and we won't worry about diseases." And the cycle continues.
Well, and I was going to ask you if any mathematical, I don't know, model pattern, whatever, to how often these things tend to happen.
Yeah, it's a very tricky one. There have been some attempts to find patterns. There was a thought that influenza pandemics were happening about every 90 years, and the thought was that actually old people were protecting us. The old people had immunity from the last one, were keeping us alive, and then when they finally died off, then there wasn't enough like protection, and we were getting it. But then they sort of debunked that as well, saying, well, it's not quite the 90-year cycle. That's what they were saying for many years, that like a big pandemic was overdue, and so when the 2009 swine flu epidemic hit, that was about 10 years later than the 90-year cycle, and so it's like but I think that like there's a lot of randomness as well. There's conditions that cause a disease to jump from animals to humans, and those are pretty random. When that happens is very hard to say. It looks like HIV jumped from bats to humans. From primates to humans at least 4 times. And so, we were never going to avoid HIV. It's like, it only takes 1 to do it, and it did it at least 4. So we were always going to get that disease. And so, maybe if the original, market where COVID jumped, had been contained somehow, we wouldn't have got it, but we might have just got it again later. So, it's a very hard thing to avoid, and it's a very random process when that happens. Once it starts, though, then it's much more predictable. And in fact, one thing we did was we looked at models that had been put out for diseases in the beginnings of pandemics. So in the beginning of the 2009 swine flu, or the MERS outbreak in the Middle East, the SARS outbreak in 2003, Ebola in 2014. Like what did the first couple of weeks, what did the models say? How good were they at predicting now that we have all this hindsight? And the answer was amazingly good at predicting the first wave. Like they really had it. Some like the numbers were astonishing. It was like, you have no data. You have 2 weeks of data and you're predicting the entire pandemic and you got it right. Like that is an astonishing thing. Yeah. What they were not good at was predicting when is the second wave, or will there be a second wave? And so this is a random process. Once a wave hits, then we can do a lot. But knowing when the wave is going to happen, or if it's going to happen, those are really random things. And I think this comes back to the issue of stories, right? Like we as humans don't like randomness. We are not good with it. Like the idea of a disease is really scary because it's completely arbitrary. Like I can just be going about my business, doing my thing, and a disease can just wipe me out. And instead we tell our stories to be like, no, well, it's only going to hit the bad people. Only the people who do certain immoral acts will get felled by this disease. And sometimes those are correlated with things that are actually happening. So this makes it even worse. But sometimes it's only a little bit correlated and people expand this. And so it's very difficult to kind of separate that out because people really want to just believe it's not going to happen to them. And the only tool they have is to tell a story. So they, gosh darn, going to do that. Right?
Yeah, and we use stories to fill in the gaps too. Like this is the stuff I don't know and I'm scared, so I'm just going to make stuff up to fill it in because I need to tell myself something.
Exactly.
And then it takes on a life of its own. And yeah, like the storytelling thing is a blessing and a curse.
It is. It really is a superpower in so many different ways, but it's not always the one. Actually, my therapist one point said to me like I was whatever the thing I was doing the same thing again and again. She said, like, I just want to honor this thing that you've been doing. It obviously helped you in childhood. It probably really saved you. It did all these great things. However, it doesn't apply to every possible situation as an adult. And I went, oh, oh, you are correct. That is absolutely true. It's like, I've got a hammer. I'm going to hit everything. Right. Everything is a nail. And it's like, right, that hammer should be used for hammer-like things. It doesn't have to be used for every single thing. And yeah, we do use stories perhaps more than we should.
Yeah, and we don't even know we're doing it a lot of the time.
Yeah, it's completely second nature.
Yeah. Wow. Well, here's hoping we've learned a couple things that we can use in the future to rein in our crazy storytelling skills when they're not doing us a favor collectively. It's the collectively part that makes it hard, right?
Yeah.
It's just...
Yes. Well, I mean, I think the age of the internet has been very... It's a very tough time because, like, we can now spread those stories very easily and very fast and to a orders of magnitude larger group of people than we could before, and the stories don't even have to be true. They don't have to have
Right.
any basis in fact, and bad actors can spread them too just as equally. So where we were really out of luck.
Yeah, the stories are their own virus.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oof. So, well, on a cheerier subject that's also story related, I'm sure you have some new kind of Doctor Who-ish project in the works or something along that line.
I do, yes. Yes. I've been doing the Outside In series for more than 10 years now. And so that's a series where I get 100 and something people to write 100 and something essays or other things about 100 and something stories. And so we started with classic Doctor Who. We did New Doctor Who. We did Buffy, Angel, X-Files, like all kinds of shows, Star Treks. And we are redoing classic Doctor Who for the 10th anniversary. And so, well, actually, it's also the 60th anniversary of the show. And that one is almost done. I'm really, really close to being finished here. And I'm very excited about this because the original volume I hadn't quite got the sense of it. I was kind of like, oh yeah, I want to say interesting things in an essay, and people send me some interesting takes, I thought Genesis of the Daleks was terrible. I was like, cool, hot take, right, go. And it's like, it's a little bit boring, right? And it's like, I love the twin dilemma. Okay, yeah, sure, but say something more, and like I was trying to get people to really say something different, not just usual. And the different I realized wasn't just flip flop the common opinions. Like it was really say something really innovative. But people took that to really mean do it in a different format, do it in really wild and very drastically innovative ways. And I was amazed by the creativity that I saw. And I'm like, you're doing something very non-fictiony, which is writing a review of a Doctor Who story in a really creative sense. And that mix is really, really awesome. And so because the first volume looks very unlike all the other volumes, I decided my wish list would be just do it again. And so I have not completely different people. I have some of the same people, but they're all writing completely new entries. I allowed one person to write the same story that they did last time. And what he's done is completely night and day different. So it's wholly different from before. And we're basically using our superpower that we figured out of how to do this for doing classic Doctor Who again. And classic Doctor Who is such my original love. I'm always willing to go back to the well on this. I've got a whole bunch of different Doctor Who books, and I'm like, oh, cool. Let's just go back and do another look at the invasion. Like I'm so excited. I think I can do this all day.
So when does that come out?
That should be out not far in the future. I think probably middle of this year is my guess. I'm waiting on one piece. I'm so close to being done. I have two other books that I am also working on at the moment, so that's a bit of my bottleneck. But when I get my one last piece in, then I can start putting that together and send it off for production, and that should be out pretty soon. That's ATB Publishing.
Very cool. What are the other two books?
One is the top 10 diseases of all time. So it's basically looking at pandemics through history and what's killed the most people. And I proposed this before COVID. And then I had a real problem because COVID came along and suddenly was number 10. And I was kind of like, oh, I don't really want to do a chapter on COVID because the whole book is about COVID in so many ways. And COVID is sort of seeded throughout. And then I was doing a bit more research and discovered I'd actually missed one. And I went, oh, actually, this one way beats COVID. So thankfully, COVID is relegated to number 11 and it's not going to take up the number 10 spot anytime soon. So my book will be current for at least a few more years.
Oh, well, that's good.
Yeah, and that one is actually that's done and should be out. It's a popular science book, so it's academic, but it's populist academic. It's a book series from the University of Ottawa Press, where it's the university that I'm at. It's called Collections 101, and the idea is to kind of talk about your academic field, but in a really friendly, accessible way. So the first book we did was Islam in the West, and it was written by an imam, and it was explaining Islam to the general public. And I was like, this is really interesting because I know nothing about Islam, and I read that book and I was like, I now know stuff about Islam, and this is really awesome because it's both depthful but also accessible. And so it's basically a series that does that in different topics. And so I proposed that one, and they were like, we really like this idea, and then of course COVID hit, and it was like, we like this idea even more. So that one should be very fun.
Are you allowed to tell us what the number one disease of all time is?
Oh, I'm going to keep the number one a secret. In fact, I didn't even put it in the table of contents because I thought the first thing anyone's going to do is like look for number one and then not
Hmm.
buy the book. So I do the chapters in reverse order. I go chapter 10, chapter 9, chapter 1 is called, well, that would be telling. And read the book to figure out number one because I basically did this. I discovered this is like pub trivia. Like everyone always wants to know, well, what's the number one worst disease of all time? I was like, yeah, I bet you do want to know. And what I'd found was I looked online and there were lots of like BuzzFeed lists and so on, like, worst pandemics, and they all contradicted each other. They all had very woolly numbers that really stood up to no scrutiny. So I thought, I can put my academic hat on. I can figure out these numbers. And I did. I have found the numbers and I have my sources. So yeah, it's like if for that alone, I was like, that's really cool. But what the book is really about is how diseases reshape societies. And so diseases have made massive changes on societies, some of which we still live with. And well, in fact, many of things we live with. I mean, we bury bodies 6 feet under because the Black Plague was transmissible from dead bodies and they realized they need to get the bodies out of the way. So let's dig a hole. 4 feet, nope, we're still getting infected. Let's dig deeper. And they basically figured out
Wow.
6 feet by trial and error. And you can imagine how awful that was. But now
Oh,
that's ingrained and that's been ingrained in our culture because putting stuff into culture is a really good way of communicating to your descendants. And so we just do that as a matter of course. And there's all kinds of things like that. Monogamy was a great way of stopping sexually transmitted diseases. Very useful practice. We don't really need that anymore, but we still do it. Well, there's a lot of, I don't personally, but a lot of people do. And so, it's really fascinating to me about how many things just kind of like are here that we just take for granted because it's just a thing that, we know because our parents did and so on. It's like, no, that's actually to stop a disease from the 1500s. You're like, oh, right, okay, that disease is long gone, but, yeah.
wow. All right. I'm going to have to read this book. And not just because I want to know what the number one disease is now.
Yes, yes.
What about the
Yeah.
other one?
Oh, the other one is it's a book on how to write for scientists.
Oh,
Because
cool.
I was reading a lot of scientific articles as I do in my job, and I was very frustrated with just how badly written they all are. And so it's I think a lot of people who write because they have to, and what they do is they hate writing. They love doing research, and they will go and gather data and run experiments and so on, and they have their lab notes, and they will like push them off to the very end. And at the very last thing they do is, oh God, I got to write, and so they will write up their first draft and they will send it out for publication. And this is a terrible, terrible idea. And it shows. You read things, you're like, this is not organized really well. This is really clunky. Like the writing is actively fighting against the information. Like, and I've had so many cases where people have come to me and said, like, can you help me publish my article? It's being rejected. And I've dug through and got, oh, you have really exciting, innovative results in here, and you have hidden them under this like garbage dump of words that's just getting in the way. And so I
Hmm.
just clear out all the mess and just rewrite it, and then it gets published in like high level journals, and people are like, oh, this is an amazing publication. And you're like, it always was. It's just that the writing is really in the way. And the problem is most scientists do not learn how to write ever. And what they do is they sort of kind of copy what other people have done, and what other people have done is pretty terrible too. So this is me basically putting on my editing hat, and because I'm a quite competent writer, but I'm an excellent editor. And so I discovered I have a real gift for editing, and it's not really sold as like that marketable a skill. I think people sort of think, oh, an editor is just someone who'll come and fix my prose or something. But editing happens at so many different levels, and there's structural
Yeah.
editing, there's line editing, and there's kind of like just making different choices. And so I've tried to be transparent about all these things so that people can get an idea of like how to do this. And I gave this to Anthony Wilson, who you've had on your show before, who is my
Yes.
beta reader, and he is a musician and a primary school teacher, and he's not a mathematician at all. And he read that thing and he said, this is really helpful. He's like, it actually became quite a meta book because I start talking about the process of writing as I'm writing a book. And then Anthony had comments. So I started talking about his comments in the book about how to revise the very chapter that you're reading. And so it's very fun to do.
Well, and I agree with you as someone who also is a writer and an editor that editing is an underappreciated skill.
Hmm.
And a really good editor can take a middling piece of writing and help you turn it into something absolutely amazing. And
Yeah.
you know, if you view an editor as someone who's just there to scold you, you do so at your own peril, unless you truly have a
Hmm.
terrible editor, in which case you deserve a better one.
Yes,
But
very
but
much.
yeah, no, a good editor is your best friend.
Oh, good editors like gold. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think even you can get a lot of the editing benefits from just like showing your work to other people. And I think
Hmm.
that's just one of those ones that like people don't even think about. Like you can just, show your PhD thesis to your mum. And what does your mum think? And your mum goes, I don't really understand it. Like, okay, but your mum should be able to understand the first bit, right? And like, like there's just basics things like that just could be done. And feedback from other people is really, really helpful. And I find a lot of people don't do it. Like they just kind of like ride in this void of darkness where they're not communicating with other people, and then
Right.
trying to communicate with an invisible audience that they don't really know who they are and how their words are going over.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that I read something from Neil Gaiman a little while ago, and I know I just mentioned this on this show with someone else recently, but where he said that pretty much any feedback that you get from anyone about something that's not working, you should listen to. But
Yeah,
how they tell you to fix it, you probably shouldn't listen to.
that's exactly right. Yes, I think I said something very similar in the book. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, what I find is people are really, really good at detecting kind of like crap. Like they're like, yeah, this sucks, and then like they'll tell you how to fix it, and you're like, no, I know why you think it sucks. It's because of something way back there that needs to be changed. Like that's really probably the secret. It's for me,
Mm-hmm.
my job is then right. Okay, they've identified a problem. Let me go figure out what the root cause of it is. All right, the superficial manifestation is probably not the actual problem. It's probably something much deeper. And usually I'm like, yeah, okay, I got this. It's actually way back in paragraph 3. Like that's what's causing the problem in paragraph 7. So let me go adjust that.
Right.
And yeah.
Yep. Well, this all sounds really exciting and really needed. So I'm glad that you are helping the clueless scientists out there, clueless about writing, not clueless about science,
Yes, yes,
to,
exactly.
to illuminate the rest of us.
I think I've discovered this is a theme of me. I really try and give back. And I didn't realize that this isn't in everyone's wheelhouse. I'm always like, I think because I came from a very different background to where I am, and I was like, oh wow, I figured out a lot of the secrets. Like, let me tell everyone. And I discovered people don't like that. Like they're kind of like, oh, don't tell them the secrets. I was like, no, but that will help. Like you get more people coming along. Like this will be great. We'll all have a good party. And it's turned out to be an odd thing. And I'm like, I will give people a helping hand up the ladder, no problem. And you know, I like doing it, and I like mentoring. I like giving back. I do that in all aspects. I think for transitioning, for writing, for science, for everything. I'm just like, let's see how can we make a better world. And I think at the end of the day, everything is local. If we act with kindness and try and help each other, we will eventually get a better world because this will spread.
Amen. And I can't think of a better note on which to end.
Fantastic.
And so this has been great. I'm so glad that we decided to do this again. It's been a great conversation. And, I hope that your hopeful view of so many things that we've talked about turns out to be the right one. So
yes, me too. But I'm actually pretty confident. I think that actually the disease book particularly gave me a really good view on history and how things work and how the same patterns just recur. But you can see things moving and changing when you take a longer view. It's actually quite hopeful. I mean, actually, the life expectancy in 1900 in the UK. So the UK at the time was the richest country in the world. Life expectancy was 45, in the richest country in the world. 100 years later, it's doubled. Like that is an amazing achievement. And how did we do that? Well, some of it was disease management, some of it was clean water, some of it was like medicines and stuff. Like we slowly have made massive improvements in life in what's relatively a short amount of time. And so I think we take this for granted because we only look back maybe a generation or two and be like, oh well, I feel like I lived a little bit longer than my parents and a little bit longer than their parents or whatever. And the actual truth is like we have done very well.
Well, hopefully we'll keep doing very well.
Yes.
So
challenges in the meantime, but yes.
Indeed. Well, thanks for coming and spending some time with me again.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. It's been delightful.
That's our show for this week. I'm so grateful to Stacey Smith for sharing her journey and her pandemic wisdom with us. And thanks so much to you for listening. Please leave a review. There's a link right in your podcast app, and tell us something you've learned from a time of transition in your own life. And if you enjoyed this episode, please pass it on to a friend. Thanks so much. If this episode resonated with you, don't forget to get in touch on any of my social platforms or even via email at nancy@fycuriosity.com and tell me what you loved. And if you're feeling a little bit less than confident in your creative process right now, and you haven't yet signed up for my free email series on 6 of the most common creative beliefs that are messing you up, please check it out. It'll untangle those myths and help you get rolling again. You can find it at fycuriosity.com, and there's also a link right in your podcast app. See you there, and see you next week. Follow Your Curiosity is produced by me, Nancy Norbeck, with music by Joseph McDade. If you like Follow Your Curiosity, please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to tell your friends. It really helps me reach new listeners. Thanks.